Welcome to this Autism Ontario webinar, Social Intervention for Children with Autism. My name is Matthew Lay, and as always, I will be your host. In an era of technology, screens, iPads, phones, social development is challenging for most, and even more so for those on the spectrum. But lucky for us, we have an expert with us today. Kathleen Quill from the Autism Institute in Massachusetts. Kathleen, thanks for being here.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Autism Ontario, for the invitation.
On today's webinar, we're going to define what is social behavior. We are going to learn how to plan social intervention, and we are going to recognize, unfortunately, that there is a complexity to this process. Before we get started, I do have some housekeeping items, as always. If you've not been to one of our webinars before, a big part of what I'm doing here is trying to get you answers to your questions. Throughout the webinar, you can submit your questions at any time using the Ask a Question box located directly below me, below the video window. Those questions will be fed up here to my iPad, and I will ask Kathleen to give you the answers if we can. Now, we never have enough time to answer all of the questions, but we are collecting them all in Autism Ontario. We'll look to get back with you following this webinar. From time to time, I'm going to reference a resource center. It's at the bottom of the console, and there's filled with links to topical websites and documents and stuff that will help reinforce the conversation and the dialogue that we'll be having on the set today. And last but not least, if you have any issues with the technology, click on the help icon. All right, with all that out of the way, let's get down to why we are here today. And I'll start with that question, Kathleen. Why are we talking about social behavior or social intervention with children? Why is this important?
Well, we know that autism is defined by children's struggles with navigating the social world. Every interaction we have with another person, from the minute we wake up to the minute we go to bed at night, is in essence social. Yeah. Except for the time that we're sitting in front of the television or the computer screen, we have to engage with others. And that is, in essence, the struggle that defines and makes individuals with autism unique. They struggle understanding how to interact with other children, with other adults. And the main way we go about doing that is, as we're doing right now, having a conversation. Right. And so the whole process of engagement is difficult for them. Right. And we don't understand why. Sadly, we don't know why. But we do know that from a very young age, the children present in a way that's very different from other children.
Okay. So let's talk about social behavior. Let's define it for our audience. To answer the question, what is social behavior?
So if we look at the next slide, and we're talking about autism,
right.
Social behavior is, first, how we interact with other people, second, how we have conversations with other people, and third, how we behave. That's an important thing for parents. Parents are always so aware of their children's behavior and how it reflects on them as a family. And the children with autism, for reasons we don't understand, have very atypical ways of behaving and interacting. We call it repetitive or restrictive. Right. So when we think about socializing, socializing requires us to be flexible. It requires us to, I never know what you're going to do next, what you're going to say next. And if I don't know how to read your nonverbal cues, like right now you're looking at me and you're nodding your head, and so I can interpret that as you're interested, you're agreeing. Other times you just raised your eyebrow. It's like, does that mean you're a little confused or you wish I would stop talking so fast? You know, but there's all kinds of signals that we give one another in the absence of words.
Right.
And we understand that in the case of autism, children struggle to interpret all of those signals.
Right.
And so in the absence of that, they tend to shift to be more solitary
Right.
in their engagement, or in other cases, they try to interact and they do it in ways that are judged by others to be different.
Right. But autism, it's a spectrum, right? So there's either end of the spectrum. These are typical. Are there typical barriers beyond the repetitive nature that you see across the spectrum?
Well, we'll answer that in two ways. If you go back to that previous slide, here we have 3 children.
Right.
If you go to the next slide.
Sorry.
Yeah. We have 3 children. So there's a little girl who's 3 years old, and she doesn't yet speak.
Okay.
And she does not engage with her parents. She finds hugs very uncomfortable, and she spends her day lining up little ducks in a row. That's an example of a repetitive
Right.
behavior. Contrast that to the little boy on the bottom right who's 9 years old, who looks very happy.
Yeah.
But he walks around talking about things that are not of interest to other children his age, and struggles with friendships. Okay. And then the third, now we have a teenage boy who drew those amazing pictures of birds. His repetitive behavior is, if it was his choice,
Yeah.
he would spend all day, every day, drawing birds
Wow.
and talking about birds without any regard to other people's interests.
Yeah.
Okay, so here we have 3 very different children. They all have the same diagnosis, but if you asked each of those children's parents what was important to them,
Yeah.
and how they viewed their child, it would be so profoundly different.
Right.
So I think if there's like a single message to understand about the complexity of autism, is that key word of spectrum.
Yeah.
No 2 children are alike, and how they present with their social struggles is going to be markedly different from child to child.
Okay. I mean, joked about this earlier, but I mean that's with everyone, right? I
It
mean,
is.
You're an American, I'm a Canadian. I can't typify you by what I watch on Fox News in general, and just
Ooh.
like. And if I did, I would be wrong. And if I did, I would be wrong.
We'll stick with autism.
Yes, we'll stick with autism. We'll stay away from the selection of our news media outlets. A wide spectrum, but there's other, call it issues, right, that go into some of these challenges with
Right.
social behavior, correct?
So as we see on this slide, which is overwhelming, it's exactly how parents feel when
Right.
they're overwhelmed with the diagnosis. Because even though we talked about their social differences, communication struggles, and this tendency to be repetitive, the uniqueness of autism is because in addition to that, you may have a child who is extremely gifted. Mm-hmm. You may have another child who has attention deficit disorder. You may have another child who has very severe developmental delays in other areas and can't access academics. Children with a range of medical challenges, all in addition
Right.
to autism. It's almost like children with autism are more vulnerable to all these other secondary
Right.
problems. And again, that's why it's such a broad spectrum of, and by spectrum we mean they present themselves in such different ways.
Right. Well, we're going to get into strategies and how we go about this. But before we do, I had mentioned off the top what I'm doing here as well is getting you answers to your questions. So we're going to take a question. A reminder to those of you who have a question, you can submit it at any time. So our first question, Kathleen, is my son shows absolutely no interest in socializing with children, even at school. Do I force playdate social clubs when he already has over 20 hours of therapy a week plus school? His iPad is his best friend.
That's a wonderful question, and where I may not be able to answer your question specifically because I don't know your son. I see lots of other children who present in the same way. And the direction that we go for an individual child is to try to expand on their interests and put them in social situations that are of value to the family.
Okay.
So if, for example, he is uncomfortable by the complicated situations on the playground,
Right.
I may say, I'm going to have him go to the Y to swim where he's in proximity to other children, but he can do it at his own pace. Or I may teach him to ride a bike so that he can bike with other children and be in proximity to them, engage with them, but do it at his own pace.
Right.
So I'm going to individualize the social activities to move him away from his comfort zone, which is his iPad, but also avoid situations that are socially too complicated. One of the things that we know, if we move to the next slide, is the best way to make those kinds of decisions is through a systematic process of assessment and assessing where he is doing well and where he is struggling, what are family priorities, and then plan intervention from there.
Well, I knew we were going to get questions just like this. We have this problem, this problem, this problem.
Right.
And because we spoke earlier, I also know that there's a methodology on how we go about it.
Right.
So planning intervention to improve social skills starts, as we can see on the slide, with assessment. But what does assessment look like?
Well, when you look at this list of assessment, it's overwhelming.
Yeah.
I think what's important is that we know that servicing children with autism requires a methodology that is driven by accountability.
Okay.
By that I mean whatever method is selected, you want it based on quality research, and you want to, and quality research tells us that you need to identify your goals, you need to have a systematic plan to address it, and most importantly, you need to monitor success. They're the three pivotal pieces of intervention. So in the case of the question that came in, we would begin with assessing different social situations that the child is in.
Right.
Ask what he can currently do in that situation, what goals the family thinks are important for him to master, break it down into small pieces, and then measure change over time. It is a complicated process, but it's an important one. And the field of applied behavioral analysis gives us a roadmap for doing that. Okay. So if I'm going to assess, I'm going to start with any child and say, so if the child's in a social situation, do they watch others? Do they imitate others? Are they socially motivated to be there? If they're not, then intervention is going to take one path.
Right.
If they are, it's going to take a different path. I'm going to look at their play skills. What do they like to do by themselves? How can they now share that experience with other children? Right. I'm going to look at them at school. Where are they successful? Do we need a structured plan for what happens at recess? What happens in the school cafeteria? What happens during after-school activities? You almost take every social activity and you look at it as, what does the child need to learn socially to be successful there? And we take it one situation at a time.
Okay. Well, I'm a father. I have a 10-year-old son who I think I know pretty well. I mean, we get along. We like the same comic books and whatnot. But when I look at this, and I think that if you had asked me to do this, I'm thinking, how would I even go about it? I mean, I go off to work every day. I'm here doing this. I don't see him when he's at school. When I play with him, it's me and him. Maybe it's a play date. Maybe it's another kid, another child. But I don't know that I'd be able to go through this process. So parents who are here today, understanding that this is the first step. Are there tools for them to go through this? Are there people they should be speaking about to? I mean,
Right.
you mentioned ABA before. Is that who they should be going to? What's the start for this?
So that is the critical question. No, parents cannot do this by themselves. Absolutely not.
So I shouldn't feel bad about that fear.
They do not do it by themselves, and I'm from the States. I don't know all the resources that exist in Ontario, but I do know that Autism Ontario would be my first step in trying to access the resources, the autism specialists, the board-certified behavior analysts, the speech and language pathologist, the developmental educator, whatever member of that team is going to guide the decision-making.
Okay.
It's a team process. It was interesting that the parent mentioned that the child has individual therapy. That I don't know what the goals are for that therapist, but that's going to be one piece of that child's intervention. The other piece is the support to the family and the child in being able to access all the social activities in their home and their community that make up their day-to-day, which is going to vary by age and ability level.
Right. Well, to that point, the Resource Center on this webinar will direct you to, amongst many things, some of those supports that Autism Ontario can provide for you. They're generally your best first stop when running into a question of a complexity like this, and they'll help point you in the direction of the supports that we just talked about. So assessment is done. Let's talk about what we do next, right? And that's the planning we call the intervention, right?
Right.
And it sounds like, it's an A&E television show. Everyone comes into a room and starts talking together. But what do you mean when you say about planning a television show? I mean, a television show.
I don't know anything about planning a TV show.
Sorry, an intervention.
Right. This chart is just a depiction of the overwhelming number of choices that parents may have been exposed to, may have had professionals talk to them about.
Right.
What we recommend, if you look at the next slide, are those interventions for which there is solid research to support the fact that this intervention helps children with autism acquire skills.
Okay.
Okay? So what we do know is that there's a long list. There's a long list of interventions.
Yeah.
And where we don't have the time to talk about the pros and cons of all the things on those lists, and the resources that exist in Ontario hopefully will help families with that. What we do know is that on this list of evidence-based practices, there are different approaches to make things more complicated, different approaches for different age groups, for different skills.
Right. Even though you can't go through them all, could you maybe help us understand what that looks like? So why one would work here for this skill and one would work here for this skill?
So most families, my understanding in Ontario is most families are given access to IBI. That's an acronym for Intensive Behavioral Intervention. That usually is defined by the first thing on that list.
Okay.
It means that children work in a one-on-one isolated setting on very, very specific, discrete skills.
Okay.
That helps children who cannot access learning in a structured play environment.
Okay.
Okay? Some children with autism need that to help them develop foundation skills for learning in other social settings. Other children don't.
Right.
So when we look at something like structured play groups, which is on the list of evidence-based practice, that basically means that you take you structure or you plan out you, not the parent, but the professional who's
Yeah.
working, may have them in a daycare center, in a preschool setting, in a clinic setting. You have a small group of children. You structure the play experience with a specific goal in mind to help the children imitate other children, to help the children learn how to play with the toys appropriately, to help the children learn how to talk to their peer about what they're doing. A whole variety of different target objectives that happen in that structured play setting. The hope being that what happens in that structured setting is then explained to parents so that they can practice similar skills when they're in the grocery store, when they're playing on the playground, when they are in school. That we move from a small setting to learn a skill and expand the number of opportunities the child has to practice it.
Right.
They're the systematic steps that we take when we're doing intervention. The hard thing for both families and educators to understand is that for many children, not all, but for many children with autism, what they learn in one situation is very difficult for them to automatically apply in the next. So you may teach a child to ask for help opening their juice container. It doesn't mean that they're going to understand how to ask for help when they need their coat zippered up.
Right.
That from their perspective, they're two very different situations.
Yeah.
In both situations, you have to communicate with others, but we can't assume. That's a really important thing in autism. I'm always assuming that the child's doing the best that he can with what he understands in that setting, and we have to systematically plan for generalization. That's only going to happen when parents are partners in the process.
Well, it's interesting you said parents being partners in the process. You mentioned school as well, because our next question that came in was, I want my son to take advantage of social opportunities at school. Son must be clearly on the spectrum. How do I get the teacher to understand that this is really important? You nod like you've heard it before.
I've heard it many times. I'm disappointed in that question. You want to find a member of your team, whether it's part of the therapists that have provided community-based services for you, home-based services, whether it's part of the Autism Ontario community of resources and advocates. You have a big enough job as a parent. You need to find someone else to be the voice for both of you,
Right.
and to open the dialogue about what autism means and how it's impacting his school. Your child should have an IEP. The most critical pieces of the IEP for any child with autism is addressing their social and communication and behavioral needs. That's first and foremost. Academic needs are secondary to that.
Right.
And so my wish for that family is to find someone that can advocate for them so that the school can better support her and her child.
So it's interesting that you use the word advocacy, and it's a great answer to that question. But we have done, I think, 2 entire webinars on the topic of parental advocacy within the school, with a very inspirational gentleman who worked in the school as a special ed instructor. Our next question is it's not the exact same, but it's got a similar answer. What's the best way to advocate for social support at school? My 8-year-old with ASD gets no support at school. As children with behavior get all of the EA support, behavioral issues, I guess, get all the EA support. And she's having issues of being bullied, being left out, and whatnot. So I think your answer is going to be similar to the last one, but you said get someone to advocate. That's something that's somewhat new to me. who would you suggest people start looking to help in that scenario? Have you seen a certain, call it a certain type of support worker be a great person to help you advocate in that position, or who would you generally go to?
I'd actually defer that question to Autism Ontario,
Okay.
since I'm not familiar with the resources and the mechanisms that are in place. The first step for that parent, again, is to reconvene her IEP team and draw from the resources from Autism Ontario. In the States, we have a bullying law, so that wouldn't occur.
Right. Okay. All right, so let's move on. So we had 3 stages here. We had assess, then we have to plan the intervention. But you had said off the top, it's about accountability, so we have to measure how this intervention is working. What does this look like?
Data.
Okay.
Data, data, data.
Right.
That means it is the responsibility of therapists, teachers, BCBAs, speech and language pathologists, educators, every person who is providing direct service to that child needs to demonstrate that the skills that are important to the family and are being worked on, that there is a measure of the degree to which there is change.
Okay.
There is nothing more powerful than seeing measured improvement.
Right.
It doesn't necessarily always have to be quantitative. You know, he went from screaming 10 times a day to screaming 2 times a day. It can also be the emotional well-being of the family.
Right.
You know, a scale that determines the parent's level of satisfaction with the change they see in their child. The degree to which bullying is or is not occurring in the school. The degree to which the skills that have been practiced in a therapy session are actually being used across all other settings. You know, if you want the child to sit quietly in school, does that also mean that they're sitting quietly in church on Sunday?
Right.
You know, you want to have measures of the degree to which skills that you're working on are practiced and generalized.
Right.
And that takes careful documentation.
So how does that look? Because, you know, I'm thinking to myself again, if it's about my, you know, child not crying or screaming in the classroom, I would think that, I don't know, someone needs to journal the number of occurrences where it does occur. So are you getting together in that care group and are we journaling these things? Like, how might it look in practice?
In practice, it looks like data tracking.
Okay.
It looks like counting sometimes the number of times something happens. Creating a rating scale so that at the end of the week you're rating the degree to which it happens. Okay. There is no hard, fast rule. There just needs to be an agreement among the team members. What skills are we looking at?
Yeah.
And how are we going to determine whether or not progress is being made? And then meeting on a regular basis to review that. It may be that the same assessment that you did at the beginning of the year, you're going to repeat at the end of the year, and that's your measure of change.
Right.
There's a variety of different tools. In the field of applied behavioral analysis, one of the core principles is about accountability. Yeah. But teachers do it in schools. They have to be accountable for reading levels and math levels. Physicians do it. They have to be accountable for immunization schedules.
Yeah.
So we need to create that same kind of documentation around social growth and behavior change.
Okay. I'm going to go to our next, got some questions from our audience. How do you deal with a child that excessively talks to himself? This behavior affects social encounters. What would you imagine an intervention around this might look like?
So the example that was given is one example of repetitive behavior.
Right.
We talked earlier about that being a characteristic. I always look at the cup is half full. So for me, a child who is speaking in verbal, that's a wonderful thing. Mm-hmm. The child who's talking to himself is repeating or trying to make sense of the overwhelming amount of language that he's hearing and may or may not understand.
Yeah.
I don't know that child, but when I see other children, any repetitive behavior is often a signal, not always, but often a signal that the child's experiencing some anxiety or some uncertainty. So with any behavior, I'm more curious about when it doesn't happen.
Right.
So tell me, because teachers will say to me all the time, he screams all the time, or he's running out of the classroom all the time. Well, he's not.
Clearly.
He's clearly not. So one of my first questions about any behavior is, please tell me when it's not happening to get a window into why it might be happening.
Right.
So the intervention is driven by the whys. There have been other webinars on something called a functional behavior assessment.
Right.
So that's when you look at one behavior that you want to change and you try to analyze why is it happening.
Yeah.
So he may be talking to himself because he's doing what we all do. He's just doing it out loud.
Yeah.
You're having an internal conversation about your next question, your judgment about how I'm doing. I'm flipping out here. Wait, oops, sorry. About how this is going to come across 10 years from now when I look back at this. The children do it, but they don't have the social awareness not to do it aloud.
Yeah.
So I don't know him, but I have more questions about the behavior, and then those answers would guide me in the direction of what to do. It can be anxiety. It can be trying to process things. Mm-hmm. It can be X, Y, and Z.
Right. I mean, very, very, that term, it happens all the time, And the answer, clearly, it does not. And sometimes it's hard when we're in these situations to focus on those positive situations when the child is not speaking to themselves. Another tactical, I guess, question here. My daughter with ASD is 8 years old, but very tall and mistaken for a 10 or 11-year-old. Oh. She's going into grade 4, and I'm worried about her inclusion at recess. What advice can I give the teachers and aides to help her inclusion on the playground? And the playground's a brutal place for everyone.
Right.
In this
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah.
When I meet children in school, their biggest struggles are in the unstructured social situations. Nothing is more traumatic than recess. So a plan for recess for an individual child, from my perspective, the way I would look at it, I would say, 1, what does she like to do? Mm-hmm. 2, who might be 1 or 2 friends? One of the practices that we always look at is peer buddies or peer friends. Who are 1 or 2 friends that I can engage with her? What exactly might they play together? Mm-hmm. What might she bring out to recess that other girls may enjoy? Right. If it's the favorite movie of the month and she's into movies, then she may bring out a book or something about that character or a TV character, something to focus a small group's attention. Okay. If she's an athlete, I may create some structured games where they're playing 3-legged races using 2 legs, if you know what I mean. Yeah. And try to structure some of the time. It's having clarity about your social expectations in situations that are chaotic.
Yeah.
that's the kind of plan that I'm going to develop for her.
Right. And again, clearly it takes multiple people at the table to make this happen, and that teacher needs to understand a fair amount about your child to help make that work.
And more importantly, it's going to take time and practice.
Right.
For some children with autism, they feel more comfortable learning a new set of social skills when interacting with an adult before they can take those skills and apply it to interaction with their peers.
Right.
Because adults can adapt
Yeah.
a little bit better,
Yeah.
where other children are more spontaneous and impulsive and unpredictable.
Right.
And that is one of the hardest things.
Yeah. And we say
For the
with
children.
Say with all children. I know that my son, sometimes when we're introducing something new and he'll say he doesn't like it or he
Right.
tried it and doesn't, but we can go and do it together, and then at the end
Right.
of an hour or two, he's a huge fan.
Right. Sometimes I look at some children as being, I almost explain it to the novice as, imagine extreme anxiety and extreme shyness. And now put yourself in a new social situation. That just might be the physical and emotional experience for many children with a diagnosis of autism every minute of every day.
Yeah.
And so respecting that and saying, how do we build skills while still being respectful
Yeah.
of the difficulty it is for the children?
Yeah.
One of the things that we know about shy, anxious people is the more we talk to them, the more uncomfortable they get.
Yeah.
So one of my rules of thumb is always, when in doubt, say less.
Yeah.
Provide young children walk around the first 3 years of life with their comfort toy, their
Yeah.
blankie, their animal.
Yeah.
That same principle may apply for children for a long time.
Yeah.
They may need something that becomes associated with security or comfort.
Okay.
The one little boy that was the question earlier, that iPad might be his security item, especially if he's watching the same thing over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Children gravitate to things that make sense to them
Right.
and avoid things that are confusing.
So it's interesting you said for a very long time. That transitions into our next question about older kids. Can you suggest any strategies or resources for the more older individuals, teen, young adults, for social skills such as maintaining conversation, talking on non-preferred topics, or just overall maintaining some of those friendships they've been lucky enough to make?
That's a great question, and I'm thrilled for that family that their child is now at a place, they have a teen who has friends, feels good about himself, and is building on the nuances
Yeah.
of conversation. There are good programs out there. There are published programs. There are speech and language pathologists usually have lots of resources. We call it pragmatics when we're working on all the subtleties of conversation. And so I would encourage the family to access, again, through Autism Ontario or whatever, the speech and language pathologists or agencies that run social skills groups.
Like the peers group, I think?
There are peers groups, there's social thinking groups, there are a lot of packaged programs that work for some children. I think what's really important for the families here today to know is whatever intervention you select, please know that what your child learns in that group needs to be practiced across many settings. It's not going to automatically occur naturally.
Okay. Lots of questions coming in, and we're going to try and get them all for you. But let's get back to some of the content that we had prepared today, because I want to make sure that we do get through it. So, I mean, everything I keep hearing today is that it's complex.
It's complicated.
Yeah. So, I'll leave this to you. This is one of the slides that you had up. We've been through the three stages, and it doesn't sound to me like there's any easy solutions.
I have spent over 40 years.
So you started when you were what, 5?
A baby.
Yeah.
Right. Now see, this is going to be permanently online forever. I tried to avoid that. Anyway, hi everybody. So 40 years in the field.
Yeah.
Love these children, empathize deeply with the families because of the behavioral struggles.
Right.
If it was as simple as improving social skills and conversation skills, that would be relatively easy to navigate. It's the big emotional piece.
Yeah.
Children who aren't sleeping, who aren't eating, who are so overwhelmed that it forces them to engage in these repetitive patterns of behavior over and over and over again, which is a signal that something's wrong, that something feels uncomfortable. And as a result, and we used to say, even a decade ago in the field, as behaviorists, we used to say, well, forever behavior, we just need to replace it with a social and communication skill. And that in part is true, but behaviors are so much more complicated than that. We are continually trying to figure out why the children with autism are displaying the range of behaviors that they are, and how to best help them. I have come to a place where I recognize that every child is different. Every family dynamic is different. There's such cultural diversity in terms of what families value, and that the best intervention is going to be one where there is an ongoing discussion about what is important, and at the same time, the intervention that's selected when he's 3 may be completely different from the intervention that's selected when he's 8 or 18.
You talked about, you've been at this for a while, and you're here because you are an expert in this space. And as we keep using words like complex and ongoing, I think it would be powerful for our audience to hear, because you've had so many successes. You know, like what are some of the stories or anecdotes that you like to use when you see a family who's just like, how are we ever going to do this?
I have met thousands of children and families, and I'm old enough to see those that are employed, those that are in happy friendships and relationships, and those that have a high school diploma, a college diploma. I really always defer to the brilliant adults with autism who inspire families, people like Temple Grandin, Stephen Shore, who constantly convey what is possible for autism. So I think about a little boy who I've known since he was 3, who now has started a florist business with his mom. And he does not have extensive conversation skills. He still struggles socially. But he and his family were able to find a path that that's providing a wonderful service to his community, and give back what they have gotten. And he's a very happy, productive taxpayer.
Taxpayer. Well, you say still not. I think it would be great for these parents to hear just how when you met him at 3 or through his early childhood, what kind of struggles did he have socially? Like how, I don't want to say bad, but how severe were some of these struggles before we started the process?
When I first met this young man, he was 3, and
Yeah.
he was non-speaking, and he was refusing to use the toilet, and played by lining up Legos in a row. And he evolved through intensive intervention when he was young, school intervention, transition services into adulthood, into a young man who is peaceful, who has a wide range of leisure activities that he enjoys, who has had jobs such as being a golf caddy.
Oh, wow.
That doesn't require you to carry on conversation.
Actually, it's preferred you don't.
Who has come in 3rd place in a swimming meet, who did not get a high school diploma, but who is a really important member
Yeah.
of his community right now, and most importantly, is peaceful.
Right.
He's peaceful.
And as you said, happy.
And then I also know other individuals who have graduated from high school and graduated from college and are sadly just coming to grips with the impact of their disability on the workforce. So which is why it is so important for those families whose children can access the academic curriculum and are doing really well in school to constantly push for the social support, because they need those skills for life.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not saying it well, but we all know that they need those skills. Even in the age of technology, when we're all in front of our phones,
Yeah.
and eye contact becomes less important, there's still a lot of social decision making that is part of
Yeah. Well, think
our
about
work
how,
life.
they might have some decent grades in school or be qualified for a position when they come out, but what's the first thing they have to do? They have to sit down in front of somebody and communicate why they're right for said job.
Right.
And those social interactions or lack thereof of skills are going to affect that process in general.
Right.
Questions are pouring in. This one says, my son has speech delay aggression sometimes and sensory issues. I know he wants to play with other kids, but I'm afraid he may hurt the kids, which he had done before many times. What should they do?
So anytime you have we use the term in education, challenging behavior,
Yeah.
a behavior that is unsafe.
Okay.
You want to access therapists that can help identify why it's happening. In that situation, I don't know the child, but in other situations, sometimes aggression is the only way that the child knows how to say to someone, do you want to play? Or it may be I'm frustrated because you won't share with me. So we need to both identify why it's happening and create a behavior intervention plan, but at the same time, I keep going back to what interests does the child have when they're alone, and how can he share those interests in a structured way next to other children.
Right.
That helps a lot.
The next one. In summer camps, they asked me what to do with my son to integrate him into the group. So at least they're asking. But they don't. This parent doesn't know what to suggest. How can I help him participate more?
Right. So all of these questions really speak to the bigger picture about the family's need for support.
Yeah.
I'm hearing over and over again that the families are taking on the role of explaining their child's autism to others. And what I hope that the families do is turn to Autism Ontario and all the related service providers in Ontario to find other people to do that for them.
Right.
We don't want services to be fragmented for children. Social intervention happens 365 days of the year,
Right.
24 hours a day. And so everyone in that child's life needs to be cognizant of the child's needs, interventions that work, and the communication among all the players is critical.
Yeah.
That's my wish for the families here.
So for those of you who are hearing this over and over again and say, well, I am asking Autism Ontario, we are here. What we mean when we say go to Autism Ontario is that there are specific people that are here to help guide you through complex issues such as this, and services that can seem complex as well. So if you're not already plugged in, get plugged in so that when you encounter a situation like this, you can get the actual help that you need, maybe even there with the camp or whatever that looks like. At the store, gym, neighborhood, etc., people will say hi to my son, and he is completely oblivious to it. How can we encourage him to monitor the world around him for social behaviors that are, directed towards him?
Right. That is a really good example of communication. If that is an important skill, which it is for many families, for their children to say hello, to greet, to wave,
Yep.
It's a skill that you start practicing at home. He comes running in when he wakes up in the morning. Hi, hi, when you're close face to face. His father comes walking in, hi. His sister comes walking in, hi.
Yeah.
You get the point. I mean,
Yeah.
it's practiced over and over and over again.
Right.
You help him get closer to the other people. You wave, you say hello. It's easier said than done.
Right.
If he is, they use the term oblivious, my guess is he's focusing his attention on something else.
Yeah.
So we need to cue him, prompt him. These are all terms that sadly the parents will become familiar with over time. Understand how to help him orient and focus before he conveys a message.
Yeah.
It's that's an example of a foundation skill that can be practiced with a therapist, practiced with mom, practiced at school, and then hopefully it occurs in the grocery store.
So that's interesting you say a foundation skill, because the next question is, what are some suggestions you have for parents who are just starting out? How have some of the families you've worked with build resilience for the long haul?
That's probably the most difficult question I've had in 2017.
Okay.
I respect that question, and I don't know how to answer it.
Okay.
The way I have helped families from point of diagnosis through the journey is by the relationship that I establish with them. So I meet a family whose child's just been diagnosed, and we talk about what's needed the first 100 days. Autism Speaks has a wonderful toolkit for families that's called the first 100 days. After that, what is our plan for the next 100 days?
Yeah.
It becomes overwhelming when we talk about what he's going to look like when he's 18, because I don't know. I wish I could say that there is a clear path for all children with autism. Every child's different. On this slide, you see Stephen Shore, who says if you've met one child with autism, you've met one child with autism. So we have to take intervention one step at a time.
Yeah.
If your child did not have a diagnosis of autism, you wouldn't be asking that question.
Yeah.
You would just be saying, what does my child need tomorrow, next week, next month, next year? And it's terrifying for families to be told that that's the steps that you take.
Yeah.
Because indeed, we know from the research that the younger that we provide quality intervention, the better the outcome.
Yeah.
There's no question about that.
Well, I mean, that's just it. What I would take when I'm hearing this, thinking of it through the lens of being a parent, is that if you don't have that support structure in place or the right partners at the table to help with what we've repeatedly said today is a complex process through the assessment, intervention, and the measurement side, that this is going to be very, very hard. So foundationally, you need to have that in place if you're going to affect this change.
And that's what agencies like Autism Ontario are set up to do, or Autism Speaks, or if you're in the school, your special education school board. I know that the education system and how special education is structured in Ontario is very different from how it's done in the States.
Yeah.
So it's hard for me to provide any guidance, but I do know that regardless of whether it's school-based, community-based, clinic-based, home-based, the setting is not significant. The decision-making process is the most important piece.
Okay.
And having an ongoing dialogue about what are we going to do next.
Well, I've enjoyed our dialogue today, and unfortunately we have come to the end of the time that we have. So if your questions were not answered, we've got them all, don't worry. We'll look to get you some answers. Before I sign off, Kathleen, is there anything you'd like to leave our audience with? Any message that maybe we haven't touched on or anything like that?
If we go to just the previous slide, I think the most important piece is change will happen.
Right.
Absolutely, change will happen. The rate at which it happens is the unknown, but change will happen. And change will be very individualized. But there's no problem too big or too small that can't be addressed when you have people that understand autism to support you. I hope that after today, the families leave energized to make that next phone call.
Great. Well, with that, we are all out of time. So on behalf of Kathleen, myself, and the folks at Autism Ontario, I want to thank you for participating in this webinar. As per usual, this webinar will be archived and available on the Autism Ontario website at some time tomorrow. So if you have any loved ones, family members, or just anyone in general who you think might benefit from this webinar, please let them know where to get the link in the Knowledge Center, and they can come and participate as well. And with that, have yourselves a great day, and we look forward to seeing you on our next Autism Ontario event.